Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk about the three overarching takeaways from the first half, the pre-All-Star break portion of this season for the Timberwolves. One so happens to be on the offensive side, one's on defense, and one is kind of an overall takeaway for the team's performance so far. So we're going to get into all that here today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. I'm also the editor of Dunking with Wolves, the Timberwolves site on the Fansided Network. Happy Tuesday, everybody. We are a little more than halfway through the All-Star break now, just a couple more days until Timberwolves action comes back. Today on the show, though, I want to talk about the three key takeaways from the first half of the season. We're going to dive right into that here in just a second. First of all, though, thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find Locked on Wolves. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves and at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so coming off All-Star weekend, of course, on Monday's show, I kind of recapped the weekend that was and everything that the Timberwolves, where the Timberwolves left their fingerprints all over the weekend. But now I want to kind of take a really kind of 10,000-foot view of the first half of the season. I came up with three key takeaways, or I guess three, maybe, I don't know, overarching takeaways, kind of the storylines for the first half of the season. One happens to be on offense, one happens to be on defense, and one is kind of a general observation. And I want to spend a little bit of time with that here today. The rest of the week on the show, we got plenty coming up. The Wednesday show is actually going to be a roundtable discussion with the other bubble teams, really, or I should say play-in teams fighting to stay out of the play-in and into the 5-6 seeds in the Western Conference. We're going to have a conversation, a roundtable that'll publish on the feed on Wednesday. Then, of course, Thursday, we'll preview Wolves Grizzlies on Thursday night, get you ready for the second half of the season. So today, let's talk key takeaways from the first half of the season to this point. I think the biggest thing for me defensively is I just think this is actually by itself, the defense is one entire storyline for the first half of the season. This was supposed to be an awful defensive team, a dynamic offensive team. I said before the season, I thought the Wolves would be a top 10 offense when it was all said and done this season. And I thought they had a shot to be a top 5 offense. And we'll get into the offense itself a little bit later. But I thought the defense to be a playoff team needed to at least not be bottom 10, right? And if it was middle of the pack or better, then we're looking at a team that's exceeding expectations. Well, we're kind of teetering right on the edge of that right now. But the story of the defense is, of course, not at all what anybody expected. The defense started the season fantastic and kind of did a nosedive midseason, peaked up a little bit, and now is kind of gradually struggling once again. And I sitting here today, according to Basketball References, defensive rating statistic, defensive efficiency, they're 17th in the league. They had dipped down to 19th. They might have even hit 20th recently, but had been top 10 really all year, easily top 12, no matter which site you use for defensive rating. They were kind of hovering in that 9 to 12 mark for quite some time in November, December, January. So how has that happened? What's the deal been with the defense? What does that say about the Timberwolves defense moving forward? What could we expect? Well, I talked about this way back in November, kind of like late November, Thanksgiving-ish timeframe, when we were all kind of looking at each other saying, is this defense for real? Are the Timberwolves played a sustainable brand of defense that they can hang their hat on and apparently be this grinded out grinded out is not the right way to say it. That's what, if you see a top 10 defense, you assume that's what that team is. Of course, this is the point exactly. That's not how the Wolves play defense. They play defense. The reason why they're a good defensive team is because of the high opponent turnover rate, which has been essentially the league best all season long. And that was part of the issue early on in the season, and that's why we're seeing the defense struggle now. The way the Wolves were winning defensively was simply unsustainable. The Timberwolves have been number 1 in turnover rate for most of the season. They're currently second at the All-Star break in turnover rate. They turn opponents over on 14.4% of their possessions, which is outstanding. The other numbers that we talked about, maybe, I don't know, 20, 25% of the way through the season, that to me were issues for the Wolves were defensive rebounding. They were dead last for most of the season. They're currently 29th in defensive rebounding. And then also opponent free throw rate. The Timberwolves are still last in opponent free throw rate. They're dead last in personal fouls committed uh, per game as a team. Those items together are a little bit worrisome. And then layer on top of that, opponent 3-point percentage. This was the thing that was always going to regress closer to the mean. The Timberwolves were top 5 in opponent 3-point percentage for much of the first several weeks of the season. And I said at the time, yes, there's some technique to it. The Wolves have changed some of the schematic stuff. It's allowing them to contest shots better. They're obviously coaching closeouts better this year, or the players are simply executing closeouts better. Those things are all true, but a combination of opponents, fluky shooting nights, there's so much noise that goes into opponent 3-point shooting percentage that at some point that was going to regress to the mean. Sure enough, it is currently 16th in the league in terms of opponent 3-point percentage. So smack dab in the middle of the league. Combine all these things together, and you've got a pretty average defense, right? If you're one of the worst defensive rebounding teams and you commit a ton of fouls, but you generate a ton of turnovers, and you're now middle of the pack in terms of 3-point percentage for opponents, makes sense that you're the 17th ranked defense. So we're finally seeing all these things kind of combine to give us a result that makes sense. What does that mean moving forward? It's really tough to parse that. Obviously, the schedule matters a great deal. The next week is really difficult, but then after that, it lightens up. You consider injuries, you consider health. Timberwolves were pretty. I mean, they're not the only team, but clearly had a complete lack of legs. Everybody on the team was exhausted the last week to 10 days before the All-Star break. And I think a lot of that is the reason for the defensive struggles. But now they've got 3 consecutive sets of back-to-backs out of the break. And it's imperative that the Timberwolves don't completely, lose track of any semblance of competent defense, or this thing could snowball in that end of the floor, because it really is still teetering. They're 29th in defensive rebound rate. They're 30th in opponent free throw rate. And they're relying on forcing opponents to commit turnovers. That said, they've done it all year long. I mean, we're 70% of the way through the schedule, and the Timberwolves have absolutely wreaked havoc on opponent offenses when it comes to turnovers. Jared Vanderbilt and his insane steal rate. Patrick Beverly, obviously doing Patrick Beverly things. Jordan McLaughlin, now that he's seen more minutes, he's a thief. He's actually got an identical steal percentage to Jared Vanderbilt. Anthony Edwards has been jumping passing lanes like crazy this season. All those guys have been really impressive in turning opponents over, and they're all solidly a part of the rotation now. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. The problem is that it's still a little bit, on some nights it will simply be unsustainable. You play against teams that are careful, that don't make big mistakes. For instance, in a playoff series, you're going to find teams that are okay with playing a little bit more methodically. You're going to find teams that are a little bit less careless with the ball, and they're going to be more difficult to turn them over. And if they have a good shooting night and the Timberwolves just simply don't contest shots well enough, they don't secure defensive boards, then the Wolves could run into some trouble. So I think the point here is that the saga of the defense has been fascinating, from fantastic to miserable to good to struggling a little bit. And what is the real Timberwolves defense? And I truly believe this is about where it will be at the end of the year, kind of in that best case 14th, 15th, maybe the 17th, 18th range. I think it's a middle of the pack defense because of the way that they play. Now, the one thing on that list that they can control, I mean, obviously you can control defensive rebounding on some level, but the Wolves don't have the personnel to be a dominant defensive rebounding team. They do have the personnel to turn teams over a lot, and that's why they're leaning into that. But something that they need to stop doing is fouling so much. I've been talking about this all season long. Whether it's personal fouls per game, opponent free throw rate, those things really add up. And not to mention, individually, the likes of Karl-Anthony Towns, Jaden McDaniels, and the guys who have been in a ton of foul trouble lately and actually fouling out of games. That's the first impact. But then obviously over the course of the game, just allowing teams to this parade to the free throw line. And the Wolves have been relatively fortunate. Opponents are shooting only the 19th best percentage against any other team, or I should say, the Timberwolves defense is allowing the 19th best, if that makes sense to say that when we're talking about free throws, free throw shooting percentage at this season. So that means that there's plenty of room for teams to start shooting better at the line against the Timberwolves. And that's another point or two a game that Minnesota is going to give up. And that obviously really hurts. over the course of a season if you're giving up an extra point or two a game at the free throw line, simply because, again, progression, or in this case, I guess regression. Well, I guess it would be progression to the mean for opponent free throw shooters. So the defense is something to watch. I think we're in a place now. This is probably about where we're going to end up when the season's all said and done. But how sustainable is it? Can the Wolves stop fouling so much? That to me is the biggest thing to watch defensively for the Wolves in the second half of the season. All right. Next, I want to switch over to the offensive side of the ball. My biggest takeaway on the offense to this point in the season, and again, roughly 70% of the way through the schedule. So we'll go through that here next. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Bet Online. Football might be over for this season, but basketball is full steam ahead for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach might land, betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds, right on down to the Olympic coverage and information that just recently wrapped up. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Now podcast, nightly recaps of every NBA game with analysis from our local experts. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Okay, let's talk offense. So the overarching offensive takeaway for me so far this season, and we could get into the weeds on the scheme and the I talked at length the other night about how, or the other day on the podcast, about how creative Chris Finch has been with Karl-Anthony Towns. It hasn't simply been the mid post thing. Earlier in the year, it was a lot of low post. Last year, when Finch first started to implement some sets, it was a lot of mid post. And the Wolves have used him everywhere. Recently, it's been a lot of face up opportunities. Then, as teams, I forget who it was, just the other night, did an outstanding job of really kind of defending the middle of the floor. And then the Wolves turned around the next game. They started using him more in the mid post as kind of a counter to that. Like, hey, come and double team him out here. He can still score from the mid range. He can still put the ball on the floor from here. He could back you down into the low post. We dare you to bring a double team because Towns has seen the floor so well from the mid post. I could spend an entire show talking about how Chris Finch has used Karl-Anthony Towns this year and how impressive Towns has been, especially really since he came back from the health and safety protocols list following the end of December. But I want to focus more generally on the Timberwolves 3-point shooting. And specifically the fact that the Timberwolves are still the number one team in the league. They bounced really between first and second all year in terms of 3-point attempts per game. The notable thing for me is that their top three-point attempters, the top three players in terms of 3-point attempts, both total and per game this season for the Wolves, are three very average 3-point shooters, actually below average 3-point shooters. Malik Beasley leads the team in 3-point attempts. He's already launched 482 attempts at 35.3%. Anthony Edwards is next at 35.5%, and D'Lo is third at 35.1%. This year, league average is somewhere around 37%. It's climbed obviously steadily over the last few seasons. Their three highest volume 3-point shooters are just that, volume shooters. I mean, they're not bad shooters. They all have limitless range. They all can get hot very quickly. But they're all pretty mediocre 3-point shooters at this point. Fourth on the list is Karl-Anthony Towns, who's, of course, 41% from three. And then fifth is Jaden McDaniels, who's still under 30%, despite shooting a lot better lately, especially from the corners. And then fifth is Patrick Beverly, who's shooting a career worst 3-point shooting percentage of 33.3%. So there's a couple things to think about here. One, what happens if they start shooting the ball like they have for their entire careers? And by they, I'm talking about D'Angelo Russell, Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverly are the biggest ones. Taurean Prince was also having a really terrible shooting year until just a couple of weeks ago, but he's all the way back up to 39% from three, which is right in line with his career averages. But D'Angelo Russell is having his worst shooting season since his first year in Brooklyn when he was 21 years old. That was the year, that was the year the Timberwolves went to the playoffs with Jimmy Butler. So to put that in Timberwolves historical context, how long ago that was, or felt, it was 4 years ago. And he shot his effective field goal percentage that year, which of course takes into account 2 and 3-point shots and weights it in favor of 3-point shots, was 48.1%. This is easily his worst mark since then. He's just a hair over 50%. If you just want to talk 3-point shooting, D'Lo shot just 32% from three that year in Brooklyn, 35% this year, which is the exact mark, 35.1% that D'Lo shot his rookie season in Los Angeles way back in 15-16 with the Lakers. So D'Lo's worst shooting year in 4 seasons, and essentially his second worst total shooting year ever. Malik Beasley, almost an identical story. He's shooting 35.3% from three this year. The last time he was below essentially 39% was his second season in the league. That was 2017-18 with the Nuggets when he first started to kind of break into the rotation. He shot 34.1% from three. This year he's 35.3%. Effective field goal percentage is, again, a hair over 50%. The only year in his career he was below 50% effective field goal was his second season. That was 4 years ago. Patrick Beverly, easily his worst three-point shooting season of his career. He's currently shooting 33.3% from three. His previous worst season was in 2014-15 with the Rockets, 35.6%. So he's a full 2.3 points below his current career worst three-point shooting season. So if the season ended today, he'd be 2.3% lower than his worst season. Effective field goal percentage, obviously the same story. He's right at 50%. He's only had one worst season, and it was that one back in 2014-15 with the Rockets. So you're talking about 3 key rotation players, 2 starters in D'Lo and Patrick Beverly, and the de facto sixth man, who's no longer really the sixth man, in Malik Beasley. Those guys are all having their worst shooting seasons in at least 4 years, and in every case, at least their second worst shooting season of their career. And yet this team suddenly still has an extremely dynamic offense. It's still been the best offense in the league since January 1st. Right now, it's 10th in offensive rating, according to Basketball References metric. They're still launching the most threes per game of any team in the league, but only shooting 19th in terms of percentage. And yet it's still so dynamic. So what happens if these guys start shooting 37, 38, 39 in the case of Malik Beasley, who's capable of shooting 39, 40% from three? What if these guys suddenly snap back to where they've been for basically their entire careers? How good would this offense be? If they're shooting how many threes a game? 41 and a half threes per game, and they creep that number up closer to or eventually above league average in terms of percentage. I mean, look out, you got to believe Sachin Gupta is sitting up there in the Timberwolves front office going, why aren't these guys shooting their career averages? Because how dynamic would this offense be with Karl-Anthony Towns dominating all 3 levels? Anthony Edwards dominating limitless range on his three, but dominating when he gets into the paint and generally dominating offensively. D'Angelo Russell doing his part. Jaden McDaniels coming along. What if these guys could just shoot like they have their entire lives until this point, basically? To me, that's the craziest thing. It's the biggest what if, and hopefully it's not a what if. Hopefully it's something that actually comes to fruition. But everywhere else, I mean, the free throw rate has been a little lower than expected this year, but it's been fine. Offensive rebounding has been good all season. Free throw shooting itself has been kind of middle of the pack all season. It's really just making 3-pointers when it comes down to it. Now, obviously, there's turnover issues have reared their ugly head at times. They're still struggling a little bit, especially of late in that regard. I think probably tired legs has something to do with it. Some of the rotating revolving door in the backcourt has hurt a little bit too, with frequent injuries to Beverly, D'Angelo Russell. I think when those guys are on the floor more consistently, then those numbers, the turnover numbers, are going to come back down. But the 3-point shooting is so fascinating. And if we look up, in 6 weeks towards the middle of April, and we say the Timberwolves are up to 14th or 15th in the league in 3-point percentage, and the volume stays the same, we're talking about a top 5 offense. I just don't see any two ways about it. The ceiling to this offense is truly limitless. If these guys all play, again, I'm not asking for career years from Malik Beasley and D'Angelo Russell. I'm just asking for them to shoot the ball like they typically have. That's all. Okay, let's close by looking at just kind of an overarching observation, a little bit less, certainly less objective here. This is going to be a completely subjective thing, and a little bit less tangible. So we're going to do that here next. First, though, before we get to that, let's talk about our friends over at. This is the time of year that I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right, thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution, though, because I actually, and this is true, I really do love eating Built Bars. If you haven't tried Puffs, by the way, you're missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. Puffs are the first ever protein infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy, they're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Puffs are a fan favorite with some incredible flavors: yummy cinnamony churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. Delicious. These are going to be your new favorite. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, including Puffs, 100% real chocolate, low calorie, high protein. Replace your candy bars with these. They are better. A typical candy bar can be anywhere from 2 to 300 calories. Go to built.com though and scroll down to the macros chart. You'll be blown away. High protein, low cal, high fiber, low carb. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Mint brownie, coconut almond, and new for this month only, white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If Built thinks a flavor might be good, they will make it. It will be delicious, and it will be good for you. At Built Bar, they're all about the taste. They make it taste delicious first, and then figure out how to make it healthy. And I don't know how they do it, but they pull it off every single time. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, let's talk overall takeaways. Um, just started raining really hard outside, so if you hear background noise, that's what it is. Okay, so let's talk key takeaways. Or I should say my last overarching takeaway from the season to this point. Let's talk about continuity and leadership and why it matters. Again, not tangible except for this. You look at the Timberwolves roster. If you're a Timberwolves fan, you're a regular listener, you're a subscriber, hopefully, to the podcast. And there's the thunder, if you can hear that. You know that there are the top 12 guys on the roster in minutes played. 10 of them are guys that were on this roster last year. The only 2 players, and I'm not even just talking rotation. Take the top 12 guys. Go and sort Basketball Reference by minutes played. The top 12 guys are all guys, or 10 of the top 12 were all on this roster last year. The only ones that weren't were Patrick Beverly and Taurean Prince. Obviously, Patrick Beverly has made a massive impact, and I'm about to talk about that impact. Taurean Prince has had his moments as well, especially of late, and has been apparently a good locker room influence and all that too. But 10 of the top 12 guys in minutes played were on this team last year. So continuity matters. And yeah, we're talking about continuity from a team that was bottom 5 last year in terms of record. And I get that. But that's where leadership, and then along with that, player development and just continual growth in terms of individual players and the team as a cohesive unit, all that's interlinked in my mind. So we'll start with coaching. Chris Finch has been a phenomenal coach. I mean, he just coached his 100th game for the Timberwolves. I think he's coached like 101, 102 now for the Timberwolves. He's just a hair under 500 overall. And there's a lot of things that he's simply better at than the Timberwolves' most recent previous coaches. In-game adjustments have improved greatly. I think that's probably the most obvious thing. The creativity and substitution pattern, creativity with rotation and lineups and substitution pattern. But to me, the biggest thing has been the leadership ability and the respect he's gotten from his players. D'Angelo Russell is the best example, probably, who has a well-documented, him and Ryan Saunders did not get along very well at all. And D'Lo has talked multiple times publicly about him and Chris Finch and how they work well together. And obviously, you need your head coach and your point guard to be on the same page. And Finch and D'Angelo Russell are. All the players clearly respect and like Chris Finch. That matters a ton. And on top of that, he knows what he's doing. He's had success. He's won championships at lower levels in Europe and the G League. He's been on a number of successful staffs, so he has credibility to the players as well. But is also, it's funny. He's kind of, at the same time, the offense is less complex in a lot of ways than what they ran under Ryan Saunders, but he allows them to have more freedom. It's truly is a read and react type offense. But the adjustments are so much more stark now. Over the course of a game, the Timberwolves will adjust their strategy much more clearly than they did over the past couple of seasons. And their strategies change from game to game much more than they did under the previous coaching staff. So all those things really matter. And then along with that, the leadership from the players. And Karl-Anthony Towns has continued to grow in this regard clearly. Is very comfortable now being the best player on the team and being the leader on the team, being a vocal leader. He's never not been vocal, but he's now understanding how to not just talk the talk, but to walk the talk. And that's very apparent. And then add to that Patrick Beverly, who adds a little bit more of the edge, and at the same time, somehow a voice of reason, and then a more steady veteran like a Torian Prince. Um, Along with, other than them, I mean, Karl-Anthony Towns is the guy, right? I mean, Ricky Rubio obviously moved on after last year. Karl-Anthony Towns is the veteran presence, besides those guys, essentially, at least among the guys who actually play. And so all those things together, Chris Finch, Patrick Beverly, the other veterans, Torian Prince, Towns' growth, those things on top of a really high level of continuity from last year. Otherwise, coaching staff continuity, at least after Finch was hired midseason last year. So we're now just over 12 months with him on the job. But I mean, the continuity since then has obviously mattered, and the continuity with the roster has mattered. So it's really kind of an interesting dynamic, the continuity of the roster and the coaching staff over the last year, and then also this little bit of added leadership in terms of Patrick Beverly and Torian Prince and the growth in Towns, and all that stuff really matters. I mean, Karl-Anthony Towns said it after the Wolves had a couple of bad losses about a week prior to the All-Star break, and he said, "This isn't the old Wolves. We're going to be fine." And sure enough, they turned right around and won the next two games after a couple of ugly losses. He's 100% right. I mean, there's been valleys. This team was several games below 500 as recently as late December. They fought through the health and safety protocols thing when 7 of the top 9 guys on the rotation were all on the COVID health and safety protocol list and out of action. The Timberwolves made it through that and are now a couple of games above 500 at the All-Star break. And the vibes are completely positive at this stage for the Timberwolves. So, I don't know how different things are going to be 6 weeks from now because the season's already more than 2/3 the way over. But to this point, I mean, is the defense sustainable? Can the Timberwolves find some more consistency from outside the arc? They've got the guys who should be able to do it. Will they be able to raise their 3-point percentages closer to their career averages? And then lastly, continuity and leadership, that's not going to change. Can that help carry them hopefully outside of the play-in and into the number 6 seed or maybe even the number 5 seed? But if nothing else, can that help them get through the play-in? If they're in the play-in, what role does a Patrick Beverly play in doing that? What role does a calm, steady influence like Chris Finch have in helping this team to get to that next level? Okay. As mentioned earlier, Wednesday show, it'll be a roundtable. Going to talk with Locked On Lakers, Locked On Mavericks, Locked On Nuggets, and there's another team I'm forgetting that's going to be part of that conversation. We're going to have a roundtable talking about kind of the 5 through 9 teams in the Western Conference and what that looks like. The teams that are pretty solidly in that mix. Oh, Locked On Clippers, of course. Clippers, Lakers, Nuggets, Mavericks. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation about those teams who we most would and would not like to face in the Western Conference field, as well as opinions on, I guess, each other's teams. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have that conversation that we'll post on Wednesday's show. So Wednesday morning, that'll be live on the feed. So be sure to check that out. And then Thursday, we'll get you ready for Wolves, Grizzlies. And of course, then the second half of the season, in quotes, will be underway. That's all we have for you today here on the show. Once again, a big thank you to those of you that do subscribe to the podcast and make Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, you can find the show everywhere, including YouTube, as well as Apple, Google, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. That's all we have for today here on the show. Reminder that the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. I mean, that's across the board. Of course, there's a Locked On show for all of your favorite teams. If you're a fan of other Twin City sports, Locked On Wild, Locked On Twins, Locked On Gophers, Locked On Vikings. There's a show for all of your sports. Be sure you're following and subscribe to all those. And also, while you're at it, you can make your second listen each and every day after Locked On Wolves. You can make it Locked On NBA. Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the NBA every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.